Welcome to the deep dive. And if you are listening to this right now, I really want to welcome you, yes, you, specifically to a completely custom-tailored journey through your own curated library.
It really is an incredible library.
It is. You've handed us this incredibly dense, multidisciplinary stack of research. I mean, we are looking at clinical studies spanning decades, deeply detailed patient logs.
Continuous glucose monitor experiment.
Exactly, those CGM logs. And some of the absolute most cutting-edge literature available right now on the science of longevity and holistic brain health.
It's a gold mine.
So the mission of this deep dive today is to really synthesize all of this. We are here to extract the most actionable and, quite frankly, profound nuggets of knowledge from these sources. Think of this as your personal shortcut.
Right, to being deeply well-informed without the overwhelm.
Precisely. Bypassing the fatigue of parsing through, dense methodology sections of white papers and getting straight to the aha moments that you can actually apply to your own protocols today.
And it is a meticulously compiled collection of data you've brought to us, and I want to echo that welcome. It's a genuine privilege to be analyzing this with you. My core belief, and the framework I always use when evaluating literature like this, is that knowledge is really only valuable when it is understood and applied.
So true.
Having a towering stack of randomized controlled trials on your desk, it's intellectually satisfying, sure, but it doesn't fundamentally alter your biological trajectory.
No, it just sits there.
Exactly. Understanding the precise cellular mechanisms behind those trials and then translating them into sustainable daily practices, that is where the actual clinical magic happens.
And that's what we're going to do.
Our goal today is to spot the underlying patterns in your research, connect these really disparate physiological dots, and clearly articulate the crucial whys driving the science.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start by looking at a massive paradigm shift in the literature you provided regarding cognitive decline. Because for a very long time, the standard medical narrative has essentially treated neurodegeneration, whether that's age-related atrophy or the onset of Alzheimer's, as a fixed unidirectional process.
A one-way street.
Right. The prevailing thought was always that once the neurons go, they are gone, and clinical management is strictly about slowing the descent. But Dr. Majid Fadoui's clinical work, which features really heavily in your stack, completely upends that.
It absolutely does.
He frowns cognitive decline not as a structural death sentence, but often as a reversible metabolic condition.
And that reframing of neurodegeneration as a metabolic issue is the pivot point for this entire discussion. In traditional neurology, the focus was heavily on the structural accumulation of plaques and tangles.
Like physical gunk in the brain.
Right, the gunk. But metabolism is the foundational process of how cells produce, distribute, and utilize energy. And the brain is an incredibly energy-demanding organ.
It uses roughly 20% of the body's energy.
Exactly. So if the localized metabolic environment becomes hostile, whether that's through impaired glucose utilization, hypoxia, or just the accumulation of cellular waste, the neurons cannot function, they will eventually undergo apoptosis or cell death.
It's like a power grid failing.
A perfect analogy. Dr. Fotoui's premise is that if you can aggressively correct that underlying metabolic environment, the brain possesses enough inherent plasticity to not only halt the decline, but to physically rebuild its architecture.
Rebuild it.
Yeah.
Which is wild. And the data he brings to support this isn't just theoretical, It's grounded in a highly structured 12-week clinical program.
Built on 5 specific pillars.
Right. Fitness, optimal sleep, brain-healthy nutrition, mindset, and brain training. Now, if we just list those out, it sounds like standard issue wellness advice.
It sounds like a magazine cover.
Exactly. But the precision with which these interventions are applied is what actually generates the results. Let's look at the case study of Carol.
Oh, this case is phenomenal.
It is. When she first presented to Dr. Fatoui, she was in her early 70s. She was utilizing a wheelchair and essentially nonverbal. The clinical assumption from her primary care team was advanced end-stage Alzheimer's.
Which is a scenario that is unfortunately so common in geriatric care.
Right.
When a patient presents with that level of profound physical and cognitive impairment, the diagnostic momentum often leads straight to palliative management. The assumption is widespread cortical failure. There's nothing we can do.
But Dr. Fatoui's protocol demands a systemic audit. Rather than solely evaluating her cognitive output, the clinical team measured her physiological inputs.
They asked what were the specific bottlenecks in her metabolic environment.
Right. They didn't just accept the Alzheimer's label. They initiated this aggressive, granular diagnostic workup based on those 5 pillars. First, they conduct a sleep study and discover she is suffering from severe, totally untreated sleep apnea.
Suffocating in her sleep.
Essentially, yes. Then, a pharmacological review reveals she is on a cocktail of highly sedating medications that cross the blood-brain barrier, effectively suppressing her central nervous system.
Chemically sedated.
Then they aggressively treat her underlying depression to address the mindset pillar. And finally, they integrate very brief bouts of daily walking. We aren't talking about rigorous cardiovascular training here.
No, not at all.
We are talking about literally a few minutes of assisted mobility.
But that minimal mobility is crucial. It addresses the fitness pillar, sure, but neurologically it functions as a primary driver of angiogenesis.
The creation of new blood vessels.
Exactly, angiogenesis, and it promotes the release of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. When you combine that increased localized blood flow with the resolution of her sleep apnea, which means her brain is no longer experiencing dozens of hypoxic oxygen-starved events per hour, you fundamentally alter the metabolic landscape.
It's like turning the oxygen supply back on.
And furthermore, weaning her off those sedatives removes a massive chemical burden from her neural circuitry.
So the timeline of her recovery is what challenges everything we think we know about the aging brain. Within 6 weeks of addressing the hypoxia, adjusting the pharmacology, and introducing that light movement, Carol is out of the wheelchair.
6 weeks.
6 weeks. She's walking unassisted. But the 12-week data point is the truly staggering one.
The MRI results.
Yes, a follow-up MRI utilizing volumetric analysis reveals that her hippocampus had physically grown by 8%.
That is massive.
To see that level of structural neuroplasticity in a 70-year-old brain in just 12 weeks, I mean, it completely rewrites our understanding of age-related atrophy.
What's fascinating here is the absolute scale of that volumetric change. The hippocampus, which is critical for memory consolidation and spatial navigation, it typically shrinks by about 1 to 2% annually in a healthy aging adult.
Right, it naturally gets smaller.
So to reverse that trend and achieve an 8% volume increase, it indicates massive neurogenesis and synaptic arborization. It dismantles the rigid dogma that an aging brain is purely a degenerative organ. It proves that neuroplasticity is retained late into life, provided the biological environment is optimized to support it.
And beyond the MRI data, the functional human outcomes are just incredible. Carol regained her independence, she actually re-entered the workforce, and according to the clinical notes you provided in the stack, she even romantically reconnected with a high school crush.
Which is just a wonderful human detail.
It really is. She went from nonverbal and wheelchair-bound to an active, socially engaged life in roughly 3 months. It forces you to question how many cases of severe cognitive decline out there are actually misdiagnosed systemic dysfunctions.
Precisely. It highlights the danger of diagnostic overshadowing, where systemic physiological issues are ignored because they are just attributed to an overarching assumed neurological disease. Her brain wasn't inherently failing. The physiological scaffolding supporting her brain had collapsed.
Yeah, the scaffolding. You included another anecdotal data point in this section that reinforces this functional recovery. A male patient in his 60s presenting with clinical obesity and subjective cognitive impairment actually wagers Dr. Fotui $100 that his memory is too far gone to memorize a list of 20 words.
A literal bet.
He undergoes the exact same 5-pillar metabolic optimization. 5 weeks into the protocol, he successfully encodes and retrieves a list of 100 words, both forward and backward.
It perfectly demonstrates that the speed of cognitive processing and memory retrieval can rebound rapidly once those metabolic bottlenecks are cleared. And if we examine the broader epidemiological data you provided, this metabolic resilience explains a lot of historical anomalies in neurodegeneration.
Which brings us to the Nun study.
Yes. You included the landmark Nun study directed by David Snowden, which remains one of the most disruptive epidemiological studies in the history of Alzheimer's research.
This study completely shifts how we view the physical pathology of the disease. Let's synthesize how they actually conducted this, because the methodology is really what makes the findings so robust.
The methodology is brilliant because it utilized a highly controlled population. Snowden tracked a large cohort of elderly Catholic nuns. Because these women lived in the same convents, ate similar diets, had similar daily routines, and lacked confounding variables like heavy alcohol consumption or smoking, it provided an incredibly clean data set.
Right, it eliminated a lot of the background noise.
Exactly. They tracked their cognitive function longitudinally for years, and critically, the participants agreed to donate their brains for post-mortem neuropathological examination.
And the postmortem findings are what completely upended the field. They found a subset of women whose brains were heavily burdened with stage 6 Alzheimer's pathology.
Stage 6.
We are talking about severe accumulation of amyloid beta plaques and tau neurofibrillary tangles, the absolute hallmark biomarkers of advanced Alzheimer's disease. According to standard clinical models, these women should have been exhibiting profound end-stage dementia.
Yet, their longitudinal clinical data showed they were entirely asymptomatic. They were cognitively intact, articulate, and functionally independent right up until their passing. The physical disease was rampant in their cortical tissue, but the clinical symptoms never manifested.
So if we synthesize this with Fotouhi's work, I imagine the takeaway is that the presence of the plaque isn't the sole driver of the decline. It's the brain's overall ability to tolerate the plaque.
Exactly. This is the concept of cognitive reserve and metabolic resilience. These women maintained highly active, socially engaged, and metabolically healthy lives. They built such a dense network of synaptic connections and maintained such robust cellular energy production that their brains simply routed around the physical ethology.
The power grid had backups,
The plaques were present, but the localized metabolic environment was strong enough to compensate.
which transitions perfectly into the clinical trial by Dr. Dean Ornish that you highlighted in your research. Dr. Ornish took this a step further. He didn't just show that lifestyle can build a reserve against the plaques. His trial demonstrated that a multimodal intervention can actively reduce the physical plaque burden.
Yes.
He tracked patients in the early stages of Alzheimer's, implementing comprehensive diet changes, exercise, and stress reduction protocols, and he observed measurable decreases in amyloid buildup.
It is a critical distinction. The Ornish data suggests that amyloid accumulation is not merely an irreversible cascade, but a dynamic process. When the systemic metabolic state is shifted from pro-inflammatory to anti-inflammatory, the body's intrinsic clearance mechanisms can actually outpace the accumulation of the proteins.
So let's drill down into one of those specific intrinsic clearance mechanisms, because the research you provided from Dr. Yoel Ju on sleep architecture is fascinating. We often look at sleep as a passive state of rest. Just lying there. But her research reveals it as a highly active mechanical cleaning process, specifically driven by slow-wave sleep.
Slow-wave sleep, which is the deepest stage of non-REM sleep, is characterized by highly synchronized, high-amplitude brainwaves. Dr. G's research focuses on the glymphatic system, which is the brain's unique macroscopic waste clearance system.
The brain's plumbing.
Precisely. During this specific slow-wave phase, the glial cells in the brain actually shrink, expanding the interstitial space between neurons by up to 60%. This allows cerebrospinal fluid to aggressively wash through the brain tissue, clearing out metabolic byproducts, including amyloid beta.
And the methodology her lab used to prove that amyloid clearance is strictly dependent on this slow-wave phase is incredibly clever.
Yeah.
They didn't just deprive people of sleep entirely, like keep them up all night. They selectively targeted the architecture of the sleep itself.
Right.
They hooked patients up to EEG monitors in a sleep lab and utilized a closed-loop audio system. The moment the real-time EEG showed the patient transitioning into that deep slow-wave state, the system played a tone through their headphones.
The crucial element of the design is that the auditory stimulus was titrated very carefully. It wasn't loud enough to wake the patient and trigger a conscious arousal. The goal was simply to perturb the brainwave activity just enough to bump the patient out of the slow-wave state and into a lighter stage of sleep.
So they didn't even know what was happening.
The subjects reported sleeping through the night and had no memory of the disruptions.
But biologically, they were systematically robbed of the physiological cleaning phase. The next morning, the researchers performed lumbar punctures to draw cerebrospinal fluid. The assay results showed a direct, dose-dependent spike in amyloid beta levels. The more the slow-wave sleep was suppressed by the audio tones, the higher the concentration of toxic proteins remaining in the fluid.
It effectively proves that amyloid beta production is a normal byproduct of neuronal activity during the day. But its clearance is intensely dependent on the mechanical flushing that only occurs during uninterrupted slow-wave sleep. When that specific architecture is fragmented, the glymphatic clearance fails and the proteins accumulate.
It really makes you wonder about the downstream effects of chronic, low-level sleep fragmentation. I mean, if a single night in a lab causes a measurable spike in amyloid in the spinal fluid, the compounding effect over decades of poor sleep hygiene must be massive.
Without a doubt.
It provides a very physical explanation for what we often just brush off as standard brain fog. It isn't just subjective fatigue. It might literally be an acute accumulation of uncleared neurotoxic proteins.
It is a highly plausible extrapolation, and it loops perfectly back to Carol's case study from earlier. Treating her severe sleep apnea wasn't just about oxygenation, it was about restoring her ability to enter slow-wave sleep so her lymphatic system could finally clear the accumulated metabolic waste that was suffocating her neural networks.
Okay, so we have established the mechanics of how the brain mechanically washes itself. But if we expand our scope, the research you provided dives just as deeply into how the rest of the body clears out its cellular garbage. We are moving from the lymphatic system into the realm of cellular metabolism, specifically looking at the work of Dr. Anna Maria Cuervo on autophagy.
Autophagy, derived from Greek meaning self-eating, is the highly conserved biological pathway by which cells sequester and degrade damaged organelles, misfolded proteins, and intracellular pathogens. It is the primary anti-aging mechanism at the cellular level, ensuring that the components within the cell remain functional and youthful.
The analogy often used is that autophagy is like a self-cleaning oven. But the crucial caveat, and really the actionable takeaway for the listener here, is that the self-cleaning cycle cannot run while there is food in the oven.
No, it cannot.
Dr. Cuervo's research highlights that autophagy is intensely nutrient sensitive. It requires the biochemical signal of nutrient scarcity to activate. If you are constantly grazing throughout the day, your cells remain perpetually in a fed anabolic state. They are prioritizing the processing of new incoming fuel rather than the catabolic cleanup of old structures.
To get slightly more technical, this process is heavily regulated by the mTOR pathway, which acts as the cell's primary nutrient sensor. When amino acids and glucose are abundant, mTOR is active, promoting growth and actively suppressing autophagy.
It shuts the cleaning off.
Exactly. It is only when those nutrient levels drop during periods of fasting that mTOR is inhibited, and another enzyme called AMPK is activated, which subsequently triggers the autophagic machinery to begin sequestering waste.
So wait, earlier in the provided research, there were extensive protocols from elite dietitians advocating for front-loading massive amounts of protein to protect the metabolism. How does a person balance the need for nutrient scarcity to trigger this mTOR inhibition in autophagy with the need to consume enough protein to prevent muscle wasting? It seems like a biological contradiction.
It is a phenomenal question, and it speaks to the need for cyclical rather than chronic interventions. You do not need prolonged multi-day fasts to upregulate autophagy. Dr. Cuervo's data suggests that simply structuring your eating to allow for true fasting windows between meals, roughly 2 to 6 hours of zero caloric intake, combined with the natural fasting window of an 8-hour sleep cycle, provides sufficient pulsatile inhibition of mTOR.
Okay, so it's about not snacking.
Right. The elite athletes utilize the massive protein bolus to drive muscle protein synthesis, but they don't graze afterward. They allow the nutrient levels to fall back to baseline before the next meal, creating a rhythm of growth followed by clearance.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It's about the oscillation between states. And the clinical evidence for enhancing this clearance mechanism is wild.
Dr. Cuervo's lab isolated a specific receptor protein called LMP2A, which is essentially the doorway that allows the cellular waste to enter the lysosome, the cell's recycling center.
The doorway to the incinerator.
Yeah. They utilized genetic engineering in murine models mice to artificially sustain the expression of this LMP2A receptor, preventing the normal age-related decline in its function. By maintaining the efficiency of chaperone-mediated autophagy through this NP2A preservation, the physiological outcomes were profound. These transgenic mice demonstrated significantly extended lifespans, maintained robust metabolic profiles, preserved their hepatic function, and retained youthful memory retention far longer than the wild-type controls. They fundamentally decelerated the cellular aging process simply by keeping the waste clearance pathways open.
Here's where it gets really interesting, especially as we tie the cellular metabolism back to macroscopic weight management. Because your stack of research includes a deeply counterintuitive premise from Dr. David Allison regarding the dentistry model of weight loss. He directly challenges the pervasive fear of yo-yo dieting.
The clinical and psychological stigma surrounding weight cycling is immense. The prevailing assumption is that repeatedly losing and regaining weight causes permanent metabolic damage, permanently lowers the basal metabolic rate, and is ultimately worse for longevity than simply remaining at a stable, elevated weight. Dr. Allison's research interrogates that assumption critically.
He argues that we need to view weight loss the way we view dental hygiene. You go to the dentist, they scrape the plaque off your teeth. You know the plaque is going to return, but you don't use that as an excuse to stop brushing your teeth.
You don't just give up.
Right. You accept that the temporary removal of the plaque provides a vital period of relief for your gums and enamel. Dr. Allison posits that losing adiposity, even if that weight is eventually regained, provides a critical period of metabolic relief for the body.
He modeled this explicitly in laboratory settings. His team tracked multiple cohorts of mice. One group remained steadily obese throughout their lifespan. Another group was subjected to cyclical caloric restriction, causing them to repeatedly lose significant weight and then regain it, simulating chronic yo-yo dieting.
And the result?
The physiological outcome was that the weight-cycling mice lived significantly longer than the steadily obese mice.
Let me push back on this, though, because human metabolism isn't identical to a mouse in a controlled lab. Doesn't the human body undergo metabolic adaptation? If someone constantly restricts calories, doesn't their thyroid downregulate and their non-exercise activity thermogenesis drop, making it harder to lose the weight the next time?
That is the exact nuance that must be understood. Severe chronic caloric restriction certainly drives metabolic adaptation, lowering the total daily energy expenditure. However, Dr. Allison's point is not that yo-yo dieting is the optimal strategy, but rather that the periods of reduced adiposity offer immense systemic benefits that outweigh the stress of the regain.
The break from the extra weight is worth it.
Exactly. When fat mass is reduced, even temporarily, you see improvements in insulin sensitivity, reductions in systemic inflammatory cytokines, and decreased hemodynamic stress on the cardiovascular system. Those periods of relief accumulate to extend longevity, challenging the nihilistic view that a failed diet attempt was biologically worthless.
It is a highly forgiving framework. The effort of cleaning the metabolic plaque is never wasted, even if it builds up again. But to understand why the regain happens so frequently, we have to look at the neurological drivers of craving. Your research brought us to the work of Dr. Charles Zucker, who examines the gut-brain axis and the failure of artificial sweeteners to curb appetite.
For decades, the dietary industry operated on a fundamental misunderstanding of the reward circuitry. The logic was simplistic. Sugar provides calories and a sweet taste. If we synthesize a compound that mimics the sweet taste on the palate without the caloric payload, we will satisfy the neural craving for sweetness and induce a caloric deficit.
Sounds great on paper.
But epidemiological data consistently shows that artificial sweetener consumption does not reliably correlate with reduced carbohydrate cravings.
And Dr. Zucker's lab identified the exact anatomical reason why. They engineered a cohort of mice with genetic knockouts that completely eliminated their sweet taste receptors. These mice had zero capacity to perceive sweetness on the tongue. They were then presented with 2 water bottles, one containing artificial sweetener and one containing actual glucose.
Because they lacked the oral receptors, the mice initially consumed from both bottles indiscriminately. The cephalic phase response, the immediate sensory reward from the tongue, was completely neutralized.
But after 48 hours, the behavior shifted dramatically. The mice began consuming exclusively from the bottle with the real glucose. They entirely ignore the artificially sweetened water. If their tongues couldn't taste the difference, the discrimination had to be occurring deeper in the digestive tract.
And that is exactly what Dr. Zucker's team isolated. They discovered that the vagus nerve, the primary cranial nerve mediating the parasympathetic nervous system and the gut-brain axis, has specialized neuropod cells lining the intestines. These sensors do not detect the taste of sweetness. They specifically identify the molecular structure of actual glucose molecules in the gut lumen.
Your tongue is easily fooled by chemistry, but your gut is an impenetrable biochemical auditor.
It checks the math.
Exactly. When real glucose hits the intestines, the vagus nerve fires a rapid, direct signal up to the brainstem, confirming that actual, metabolizable energy has been secured. Artificial sweeteners completely bypass this neuropod sensor. They light up the sensory receptors on the tongue, making a promise of calories to the brain. But when the compound reaches the gut, the vagus nerve remains silent.
The alarm bells ring.
The brain realizes the caloric promise was broken, and it aggressively upregulates cravings to fulfill the deficit. You literally cannot outsmart your own neurobiology.
It is a profound evolutionary survival mechanism. The post-ingestive reward circuit demands actual energy, not the illusion of it. This beautifully contextualizes the protocols you included from registered dietitians Emily Mitchell and Rachel DeVoe regarding how elite athletes manage their metabolic demands.
Elite athletes do not operate in a state of chronic restriction. They utilize periodization. They spend the vast majority of their year eating at maintenance or in a slight surplus to protect their basal metabolic rate and support training adaptations. They only implement caloric deficits during strictly defined off-season cutting windows.
By periodizing their nutrition, they avoid the severe metabolic adaptation we discussed earlier. Furthermore, when they are in those cutting phases, their macronutrient composition is highly strategic. The data indicates they consume protein at levels far exceeding the standard recommended daily allowance, often targeting 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight.
Rachel DeVoe's protocol specifically advises front-loading a massive bolus of 25 to 40 grams of protein immediately at breakfast. She refers to this as killing food noise. If you consume that volume of dense amino acids first thing in the morning, you actively suppress the release of ghrelin, the hunger hormone, and stimulate the release of satiety peptides like GLP-1 and PYY.
You are utilizing biochemistry to physically mute the vagus nerve's alarm system, stabilizing blood glucose, and neutralizing cravings for the remainder of the day.
It is a masterclass in utilizing specific macronutrient timing to dictate the endocrine response, rather than relying on sheer willpower to fight a biological craving cascade.
Absolutely.
Now, we can't transition away from gut health without addressing the alarming environmental toxicology data you included from Josephine Musco regarding microplastics.
It's sobering data.
The sheer scale of the contamination is difficult to comprehend. The research notes that steeping a single standard plastic tea bag at 95 degrees Celsius releases approximately 11.6 billion microplastics and 3.1 billion nanoplastics into the water.
One single tea bag. The thermal degradation of the polyethylene terephthalate, or PET, releases a staggering volume of synthetic polymers directly into a consumable liquid. And while the microplastics are concerning, the nanoplastics are particularly insidious due to their microscopic size.
They pass right through.
They are capable of translocating across the intestinal epithelial barrier, entering systemic circulation, and bioaccumulating in distal organs, carrying highly disruptive endocrine-disrupting chemicals with them.
It reads like an unavoidable modern crisis, but Musco's research provides a highly actionable clinical mechanism for excretion. It isn't about extreme detox protocols. It's about optimizing the physiochemical binding properties of the gut microbiome. The protocol involves significantly upregulating the intake of specific soluble fibers, such as acacia gum, in conjunction with targeted probiotic strains.
Soluble fiber possesses highly hydrophilic properties. When it encounters water in the gastrointestinal tract, it forms a viscous, gel-like matrix. This matrix acts as a physical binding agent, sequestering bile acids, excess cholesterol, and notably foreign polymeric particulates like microplastics, preventing their absorption across the gut wall.
But the real biochemical heavy lifting is done by the probiotics. The clinical evidence in your sources focuses on lactobacillus, a highly common bacterial strain found in fermented foods like yogurt and kimchi. The research shows that lactobacillus actively interacts with and binds to these foreign synthetic polymers within the gut lumen.
The bacterial cell walls of these specific strains have an affinity for binding to the microplastic surfaces, essentially clumping them together within the fiber matrix, ensuring they are excreted via the digestive tract rather than absorbed systemically.
The efficacy is incredible. The clinical data you provided demonstrates that consistent supplementation with lactobacillus and soluble fiber can decrease the systemic concentration of blood microplastics by up to 82%.
82%.
It is a profound testament to the defensive capabilities of an optimized microbiome.
It highlights a recurring theme in this research stack. When the biological environment is provided with correct raw materials, whether that is oxygen for the brain, fasting windows for the cells, or fiber for the gut, the body's intrinsic clearance mechanisms are remarkably robust.
Which provides the perfect transition into the next major biological system covered in your research. We are moving from the localized mechanics of the gut into the systemic cascading effects of hormone health, specifically focusing on the midlife transition and menopause. The case study you included regarding Halle Berry's diagnostic journey is both harrowing and deeply indicative of a systemic failure in clinical medicine.
This raises an important question about how the physiological shifts of female aging are clinically interpreted. The genitourinary symptoms of menopause are often profoundly misunderstood or misattributed, leading to significant delays in appropriate care and immense psychological distress for the patient.
The specifics of her case are startling. At age 54, she experiences the sudden onset of excruciating vaginal pain, pain so severe it necessitates an emergency visit to her physician. Her doctor conducts a visual examination and immediately misdiagnoses her with the worst case of herpes he'd ever seen.
To receive an acute diagnosis of an incurable sexually transmitted viral infection with absolutely no prior history or indication is a catastrophic psychological event. It fundamentally alters a patient's perception of their own health, their intimate relationships, and their trust in their physiological baseline.
She endures 72 days of immense anxiety and relationship strain, waiting for the comprehensive lab panels to return. And when they do, the virology reports are completely negative. There was no viral pathogen. The severe inflammation, tissue degradation, and extreme pain were entirely the result of menopause-induced vaginal atrophy.
The clinical term is the genitourinary syndrome of menopause. Estrogen is critical for maintaining the structural integrity, elasticity, and lubrication of the vaginal epithelium. When systemic estrogen levels plummet during menopause, the localized tissue undergoes rapid atrophy.
It breaks down.
The collagen degrades, the tissue thins dramatically, and the localized microbiome shifts, causing severe inflammation that can visually mimic an acute infectious outbreak. The fact that a practicing physician failed to recognize a hallmark symptom of localized estrogen deprivation in a 54-year-old woman is a staggering indictment of the gaps in specialized training regarding female aging.
Following this ordeal, Halle Berry became a highly vocal advocate for comprehensive, personalized, bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. And her protocol wasn't limited just to estrogen. She noted that the targeted application of testosterone fundamentally resolved her severe midlife depression and restored her vitality and libido.
There is a pervasive misconception that testosterone is strictly a male hormone. In reality, healthy females produce and require significant amounts of testosterone. It acts as a potent neurosteroid, profoundly influencing dopamine synthesis and receptor density in the brain.
So it drops.
When testosterone levels decline during perimenopause and menopause, the resulting disruption in dopaminergic signaling often manifests clinically as severe lethargy, anhedonia, and depression. It is a biochemical deficit, not necessarily a primary psychological disorder.
You also included clinical commentary from Emily Morse, who addressed the intense fear-mongering that still surrounds hormone replacement therapy. She emphatically clarified the safety profile of localized vaginal estrogen for women over 40 experiencing this type of tissue atrophy and pain.
The lingering anxiety regarding hormone therapy is largely a hangover from the early, highly publicized interpretations of the Women's Health Initiative studies from decades ago, which relied on systemic, synthetic, oral estrogens and progestins. The modern clinical consensus is abundantly clear: localized, topical vaginal estrogen therapy has negligible systemic absorption. It works purely on the targeted receptors in the epithelial tissue, carrying an exceptionally high safety profile and providing immense relief from the mechanical degradation of the tissue.
But the hormonal shifts of midlife don't just affect localized tissue and mood. They completely re-engineer the body's metabolic landscape. Your research included the protocols of nurse practitioner Cynthia Thurlow, who issues a severe warning regarding midlife nutrition. Do not attempt to starve the midlife body.
The interplay between declining sex hormones and metabolic function is complex. As estrogen and progesterone levels fluctuate and drop, the female body frequently experiences a decrease in insulin sensitivity. Simultaneously, the body becomes highly sensitized to the effects of cortisol, the primary glucocorticoid responsible for managing stress and mobilizing energy.
And this is the exact trap so many women fall into. They observe the changes in their body composition, perhaps an increase in visceral adiposity around the midsection, and they deploy the traditional, outdated advice of extreme caloric restriction. They drop their intake to 600 or 700 calories a day and initiate aggressive fasting protocols. But Thurlow breaks down exactly why this biological math fails. Because the system is now hypersensitive to cortisol, that severe caloric deficit doesn't signal the body to burn fat. It triggers a massive systemic starvation alarm.
Cortisol's primary evolutionary function during perceived starvation is to secure immediately available energy and preserve vital reserves. When cortisol spikes in response to severe caloric restriction, it aggressively drives the storage of visceral fat, deep belly fat, as an emergency caloric reservoir.
It hoards it.
More destructively, high cortisol is profoundly catabolic to skeletal muscle. It initiates the breakdown of muscle tissue to harvest amino acids for hepatic gluconeogenesis, the liver's process of creating new glucose. You are actively degrading your highly metabolic muscle tissue, which inherently lowers your basal metabolic rate further.
It is a devastating biological loop.
Yeah.
You starve yourself to lose the visceral fat, the stress of the starvation causes your body to cannibalize its own muscle, and the resulting hormonal cascade forces it to store more visceral fat. Thurlow's protocol to disrupt this cycle is highly specific: a mandatory minimum of 100 grams of dietary protein daily, paired with heavy resistance training.
In a low estrogen, high cortisol environment, the mechanical tension provided by heavy strength training is absolutely vital. It forces the upregulation of the mTOR pathway in the muscle tissue, driving muscle protein synthesis. When paired with the high amino acid availability from the 100 grams of protein, you improve insulin sensitivity at the muscular level and halt the catabolic effects of the cortisol. You are using mechanical and nutritional signals to force the body to remain robust.
This theme of utilizing behavioral inputs to force a biological response leads us perfectly into the final major section of your research stack. We've optimized the brain's physical clearance, we've tuned the cellular metabolism, and we've balanced the hormonal cascades. Now we examine the autonomic nervous system. How do we regulate the machine on a daily basis? We begin with Jay Shetty's 6-step morning routine, which is entirely anchored in peer-reviewed neurobiology.
The concept of a morning routine is frequently diminished as mere productivity advice, but the clinical data Shetty aggregates frames these specific actions as non-negotiable biological anchors. The precise sequence of sensory inputs you subject your nervous system to in the first hour of waking dictates your neurochemical baseline for the subsequent 16 hours.
Let's aggressively unpack the clinical mechanics of each step. Step 1. The absolute prohibition of the snooze button. The rationale here goes far beyond simple discipline. It's about the neurobiology of sleep inertia and REM fragmentation.
When an alarm interrupts your sleep, it forces a rapid transition from an unconscious state to a conscious one. If you hit the snooze button and immediately return to sleep, your brain attempts to initiate a brand new full 90-minute sleep cycle.
Which you're only going to get 9 minutes of.
Right. When the alarm fires again 9 minutes later, it brutally interrupts the earliest, most chemically sensitive phase of that new cycle. This rapid, repeated fragmentation traps the brain in a state of profound neurochemical confusion, leaving high concentrations of adenosine, the molecule that drives sleep pressure, bound to your receptors. The resulting grogginess, clinically termed sleep inertia, can significantly impair cognitive processing and reaction times for hours.
Step 2 involves securing 10 to 20 minutes of bright morning light exposure within 60 minutes of waking. The data here is incredibly strong. Studies monitoring office workers show that those exposed to bright directional morning light scored substantially higher on cognitive performance batteries after just 5 days. But more importantly, it controls the biological countdown for melatonin.
The mechanism here relies on intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells located in the eye, which contain a photopigment called melanopsin. These cells do not contribute to conscious vision. Their sole purpose is to detect the intensity and wavelength of environmental light.
Like light sensors.
Exactly. When hit with bright morning photons, they send a direct electrical signal via the retinohypothalamic tract to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the central pacemaker of the brain. This signal immediately halts the residual secretion of melatonin and, critically, sets a 14-hour biological timer that dictates exactly when melatonin will be released that evening. You are actively programming tonight's sleep architecture with this morning's light exposure.
Step 3 is the intervention everyone actively resists. But the physiological payoff is undeniable: the 90-second cold shock. Terminating a warm shower with 60 to 90 seconds of pure, unheated water. The clinical data demonstrates that this specifically activates the vagus nerve and significantly depresses circulating cortisol and negative subjective mood ratings for up to 3 hours post-exposure.
The rapid drop in skin temperature triggers a massive acute sympathetic nervous system response, a spike in adrenaline and noradrenaline. However, the body must immediately engage the parasympathetic nervous system, heavily mediated by the vagus nerve, to regulate the respiratory rate and control the panic response. This process of forcing the nervous system to rapidly toggle from high stress back to baseline control functions as physiological resilience training, resulting in a sustained, chemically driven state of calm alertness.
Step 4 transitions from physiological stress to psychological processing. 15 to 20 minutes of expressive journaling. The data from the University of Texas highlights that this isn't just a reflective exercise. It has physical, measurable outcomes, including reductions in blood pressure and a drop in systemic cortisol levels by up to 23%. By structuring your thoughts on paper, you are physically shifting the metabolic activity in the brain away from the amygdala, the primitive fear and threat detection center, and forcing it into the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function and logical processing.
Emotions that remain unarticulated are processed by the amygdala as raw, unstructured threat stimuli. The physical act of writing requires the utilization of language, grammar, and linear syntax. To accomplish this, the brain must heavily recruit the prefrontal cortex to organize and label the emotional data. This functional shift in cerebral blood flow inherently downregulates the hyperactive firing of the amygdala, functionally disarming the panic response.
And finally, step 5, delaying interaction with your smartphone. Accessing high-stimulus digital feeds within the first hour of waking spikes baseline dopamine levels unnaturally and induces a phenomenon known as attention residue.
Attention residue is a well-documented cognitive penalty. When you rapidly task switch between highly disparate pieces of information, an urgent email, a distressing news headline, a social media post, a portion of your working memory remains subconsciously dedicated to processing the previous stimulus. By subjecting your brain to this rapid-fire context, switching immediately upon waking, you intentionally fracture your attentional capacity, severely degrading your ability to maintain sustained focus on complex tasks later in the day.
And what exactly we are consuming on those screens leads directly into the research you provided from Dave Asprey regarding the biological cost of doomscrolling. Asprey's analysis looked at civilian populations who compulsively consume highly graphic, distressing geopolitical and conflict news on their mobile devices.
The psychophysiological findings here outline a severe evolutionary mismatch.
These are individuals situated thousands of miles away from any actual conflict in completely safe physical environments who are developing legitimate PTSD-like symptomologies simply from their media consumption. They exhibit chronic emotional dysregulation and sustained elevations in baseline cortisol. They're literally accelerating their own cellular aging by mainlining digital trauma.
The human threat detection system, anchored by the amygdala, evolved to respond to immediate physical dangers in our direct sensory environment. It lacks the nuanced capacity to distinguish between a vivid, high-definition threat displayed on a screen and a physical threat standing in the room. When you endlessly scroll through imagery of global collapse, the brain constantly triggers the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, flooding the body with cortisol and epinephrine to prepare for physical fight or flight that never actually occurs.
But the body still pays the price for the alarm.
The sustained metabolic cost of maintaining that physiological emergency state accelerates telomere shortening and cellular wear and tear. The clinical advice is unequivocal: aggressively curate and cap your exposure to distressing media, and when you do consume it, you must actively engage in nervous system regulations, such as physical movement, to metabolize the mobilized stress hormones.
So what does this all mean? How do we actively intervene when our nervous system is trapped in that hypervigilant loop? You brought us highly specific clinical research from Dr. Jay Wiles, focusing on the mechanics of resonance breathing.
Resonance breathing is one of the most effective, mathematically precise tools available for establishing control over the autonomic nervous system. It involves systematically decelerating your respiratory rate to a very specific frequency, typically landing between 4.5 and 6.5 breaths per minute, depending on the individual's physiology. At this exact pace, you induce a state of coherence where your respiratory rhythm aligns perfectly with your heart rate and your baroreceptor reflexes, which govern blood pressure.
The data indicates that practicing this specific breathing cadence for just 10 minutes a day, 4 times a week, drives a massive increase in heart rate variability, or HRV, which is the gold standard biometric for measuring the adaptability and resilience of the nervous system.
By synchronizing the respiratory and cardiovascular systems, you maximize the efficiency of pulmonary gas exchange and profoundly stimulate vagal tone. You are essentially training the nervous system's brakes, enhancing its ability to rapidly decelerate from a state of stress back to a restorative parasympathetic baseline.
And Dr. Wiles actually co-developed a tangible biofeedback device to eliminate the guesswork of finding this rhythm. It is called the Ohm. It's a small physical stone that you hold, equipped with a PPG sensor, a photoplethysmography sensor, similar to the optical array on the back of a high-end smartwatch. This sensor utilizes light absorption to measure the volumetric changes in your microvascular blood flow, essentially mapping your highly unique autonomic footprint in real time. It calculates your exact mathematical resonance frequency and then uses personalized haptic vibrations and light cues to guide your inhalation and exhalation perfectly to that specific pace.
The brilliance of this application is that it removes the cognitive load of counting seconds. By translating the biological data into a tactile sensation, the user's brain can completely surrender to the physiological rhythm, bypassing the analytical thought processes that often hinder traditional meditation practices.
Which is critical because, as the final piece of your research from Henry Schuckman demonstrates, the human brain is exceptionally poor at simply doing nothing. He delves into the neurobiology of the default mode network and the true physical nature of anxiety.
The default mode network, initially conceptualized following discoveries by Hans Berger regarding EEG activity in the 1920s and later solidified by neuroimaging, represents a profound shift in understanding brain states. This is the interconnected network of brain regions that becomes highly metabolically active, specifically when you are at rest and not focused on an external task.
And what the neuroimaging reveals is that when the brain is untethered from an external task, it is biologically hardwired to time travel. It immediately begins running simulations, reviewing past regrets, or projecting future catastrophes. So if you've ever attempted to meditate and became frustrated because your thoughts immediately spiraled into anxiety, you aren't failing at meditation. Your brain is executing the exact survival programming that millions of years of evolution designed it to do. The goal of mindfulness is not to forcefully shut off the simulator.
Exactly. The default mode network's evolutionary purpose is to simulate potential threats in order to keep you safe. The objective of mindfulness practices is simply to train the brain to recognize the simulation and to stop reacting to it as if it were present moment reality.
And Schuckman provides an incredibly potent physiological technique for achieving this. The clinical data suggest that 94% of what we label as anxiety is actually experienced as acute physical sensations in the body, specifically the chest. We conceptualize anxiety as a purely mental phenomenon, a swirling narrative of worry in our heads. But it is overwhelmingly an interoceptive physical experience, a tightness, a rapid fluttering, heavy pressure. Schuckman's protocol advises that during meditation, when the anxious narrative begins, you must actively locate the physical manifestation of that emotion in your body. You drop your attention entirely into the sensation in your chest. By focusing your cognitive resources on objectively observing the physical feeling, you actively rob the mental worry story of the attention it requires to sustain itself.
You are intentionally reallocating cerebral blood flow and processing power from the default mode network, the conceptual worry center, and driving it into the interoceptive network, which governs the internal sensing of the body. The brain simply does not possess the bandwidth to maintain a high-level conceptual panic narrative while simultaneously engaging in focused, non-judgmental observation of a localized physical sensation. It functions as a biological override switch, starving the anxiety of its cognitive fuel.
What a phenomenal, sweeping journey this stack of research has provided. Let's synthesize the sheer volume of physiology we've unpacked in this deep dive. We started by dismantling the old dogmas of cognitive decline, learning from Dr. Fotui that optimizing the metabolic environment can induce structural neuroplasticity, as seen in Carroll's 8% hippocampal growth. We learned the mechanics of the glymphatic system, understanding that slow-wave sleep is the critical phase where the brain mechanically washes away Alzheimer's-related amyloid protein.
We transitioned into cellular metabolism, detailing how the inhibition of mTOR through precise fasting windows activates chaperone-mediated autophagy, allowing the cells to clear damaged proteins. We reevaluated weight management through Dr. Allison's dentistry model, recognizing that cyclical reductions in adiposity provide profound metabolic relief.
We explored the gut-brain axis, discovering that the vagus nerve cannot be tricked by artificial sweeteners because it actively senses the molecular structure of glucose. We analyzed the periodized nutrition of elite athletes, understanding how front-loading massive doses of protein manipulate satiety hormones to extinguish food noise. We addressed the environmental threat of microplastics, learning how the physiochemical properties of soluble fiber and lactobacillus can drastically reduce systemic contamination.
We examined the systemic shifts of midlife, highlighting the critical need for localized hormone replacement to prevent severe tissue atrophy and the necessity of high protein and heavy mechanical tension to combat the cortisol-driven catabolism of the perimenopausal transition. And finally, we detailed the protocols for autonomic regulation, leveraging circadian biology with morning light, utilizing cold exposure for vagal stimulation, mitigating attention residue by delaying digital inputs, and utilizing biofeedback and interoceptive awareness to downregulate the default mode network.
It is an incredibly dense, multi-layered physiological roadmap.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the most critical framework to adopt is one of experimentation, not perfection. The objective of analyzing this vast array of research is not to construct an overwhelming, rigid daily protocol. The objective is to identify a single high-leverage intervention. Perhaps tomorrow you focus exclusively on manipulating your satiety hormones by front-loading protein. Or perhaps you focus entirely on initiating the physiological resilience training of the 90-second cold shock. Isolate one variable, execute the protocol, and empirically observe how your highly unique biology responds.
I love that approach. Isolate one variable. But before we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building entirely on the incredible architecture of the sources you brought us. As we analyze these disparate fields of study, a profound underlying pattern emerged. Notice the immense, undeniable interconnectedness of the human machine. Think about the vagus nerve. It repeatedly surfaced across entirely different medical disciplines. It was the sophisticated sensor in the gut demanding actual glucose to satisfy the reward circuit. And yet, it was the exact same cranial nerve responsible for rapidly downregulating systemic cortisol when your skin was exposed to freezing water. Think about how 94% of our conceptual psychological anxiety is actually processed as a tangible physical sensation in the tissues of the chest. Think about how a microscopic physical accumulation of toxic proteins in the brain is cleared not by a neurological drug, but by the mechanical architecture of your sleep cycle. Modern clinical medicine is highly compartmentalized. It frequently treats the brain, the gastrointestinal tract, the endocrine system, and the cardiovascular system as completely isolated silos, managed by entirely different specialists. But the foundational truth, hidden in all of the research you provided today, suggests something radically different. Perhaps the true secret to longevity isn't about isolating a single pharmacological cure for a single failing organ. Perhaps what we call aging and chronic disease are fundamentally just progressive communication breakdowns across these interconnected networks. What if the ultimate key to living vibrantly, to maintaining robust health into your later decades, isn't about traditional anti-aging at all? What if it's simply about becoming a more precise, attentive conductor for the biological symphony constantly playing inside you? Ensuring that the metabolic signals from the gut are singing in perfect harmony with the neural networks in the brain, and that the hormonal cascades are keeping the exact right tempo for your cellular metabolism. It completely reframes how we interact with our own physiology. You aren't desperately trying to fix broken, disparate parts. You're actively tuning a highly integrated instrument. Thank you so much for bringing such an exceptionally researched, thought-provoking stack of sources to the table for this deep dive. Keep experimenting, keep paying close attention to the intricate music of your biology, and we will catch you on the next one.